All right, so thanks everyone for joining. Although under not necessarily the best circumstances. So for those of you that don't know, meetup.com is currently down, and unless you saw the link in the front end or developers channel on ZA Tech, there wasn't really another way for you to get here. So those that were able to find their way here somehow, good to have you guys here. Yeah, it's just a pity that you know, the rest of the guys probably couldn't find a way to get here. But yeah, I think my introduction of Justin is also just going to be not as grandiose now, because most of you already actually know him. So I might still say that I myself very much look up to him, specifically when it comes to CSS and just kind of like layout and anything at the intersection between design and front-end development. This guy has been doing it for, I guess, what feels like forever. Like Justin's one of those people that I kind of regarded as a front-end developer before front-end development was actually even a thing. But yeah, so I'll also give him a short opportunity to just introduce himself, kind of, and give a bit of an overview of what the talk is going to be about.
Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about what I've kind of just generally called modern layout on the web. And I'm going to run you through, to start off, I'm going to go through like a history of layout on the web, because I've been doing this for a long time. And I always like to share the terrible frustrations that we had in the beginnings of what we now call front-end development, but back then called web design. Yeah. Right. So I'm going to take you through a history, and then I'm going to look at a couple of things that we now have at our disposal to make layouts a lot easier, namely Flexbox, grid, logical properties, and things like within grid, like the new Masonry layout and gap properties. I'm not going to go into great detail on things like Flexbox and grid. I'm just going to explain their basic principles because they're pretty complex. And I'll show some examples at the end. I've created a little website, which is kind of a work in progress, and I'll share the link to that. And I aim to update that with things related to layout as we get more support for all the cool things we now have in browsers. Okay, if you don't know me, I work at a company called NML, where I'm head of design and front end. I'm also a co-founder of this meetup group and co-organizer with Scott and Shaylin. Okay, so let's get right into it. So layout on the web, a history. This is the very first website, and it was built in 1991 by Tim Berners-Lee, and it's now up on at CERN, and it's now up on the CERN history project, hypertext project, where they have curated and put together everything that's related to it. The reason why I'm sharing it is just to show that, okay, so this is 1991, is just to show that layout at this point in HTML, there are just two types of layouts. That's block and inline. Okay, and there's no CSS at this point. Styling does not exist. The style is done by the browser itself. And that was actually something that Tim Berners-Lee was keen on. That browser makers would determine their own styles, rather than style becoming something that was in the purview of people who were building for the web. Right, so what have we got here? So we've got an H tag, H1 tag, we've got some P tags, we've got some A tags, and then we actually have a definition list. Something that hardly anyone ever uses, but still a pretty useful thing. And those are tags that are all around still at the moment. If you view the source of this, you'll see that all the tags are written in uppercase, as was the case with the first iteration of HTML. and you'll see some things that are quite odd. But I recommend going to this and checking it out and viewing the source. It's quite interesting as a historical document. Okay, so what we're seeing there is something that we refer to as flow layout. And we still have flow layout. It specifically refers to block and inline level HTML content. And block level content in HTML always flows from the top to the bottom. So we know if we go have a bunch of paragraphs in our HTML, that when we open that in the browser, the order is going to be preserved as we have it in the HTML due to the way that block layout works. Now we have another, and so there we have, the paragraphs and the definition lists being block elements and the A tags being our inline elements. This is also sometimes referred to as phrasing and flow content. And phrasing content is usually a replaced element, like an image or something that is displayed inline. And phrasing content is always visible on the screen. You can always see it. Whereas other flow content that's display block rather relates to semantics. So, for a TR, for example, we would have a display table row, and we don't necessarily see that on the screen. So flow content, we generally don't see on the screen. It's structural, whereas phrasing content is our actual content. Right. So I went and looked at the Web Design Archive, which is a really great site that collects web design, through the ages, so to speak. And we jumped ahead from 1991 to 1994. And I just took a bunch of screenshots. And as you can see, nothing much has changed, right? Except for one thing, and that is that we now have the ability to put in images made in versions of Photoshop #1, I'm guessing, judging by the quality. So 3 years later, everything is the same, but there's so there are no new HTML tags really, except for the image tag by this point. And the image tag has a long and storied history. That would be a talk on its own, which I'm not going to go into. But if you're interested, there's a really great site called History of the Web. And there's a bunch of really interesting articles on there, including one on the evolution of the image tag. It's a convoluted story. Right. So after flow content, HTML introduced tables, which were always meant for what tables are meant for, which is data. But this was abused and again, this happens just after 1994. So, just after we're seeing this, suddenly we're starting to get into HTML tables. And these forced sites into perfect configurations using data tables, or I should say abusing data tables, because that's not what they were meant for. And so visual design hacks were prioritized over what we can call the semantic web. And if you were around in this time, you would know about things like spacer GIFs and tables nested inside other tables. It wasn't pretty. A huge amount of markup in the HTML to create fairly simple layouts. Right, so at this time, remember, we don't have CSS yet. So, and we're also doing everything in uppercase. So here we might have done something like table, and then we had access to some styling properties via HTML attributes. So we could have gone table, BG color, and set that, and then border equals 10 would set a border size, border color would set the main border color light would set a light border color, and border color dark would set a dark color. We could then add a width. And then we had the align property, which allowed us to center things in the middle of the screen. So that would create a table that's 80% of the screen wide. It's aligned in the center. And then we would put everything inside, a table row with table cells. And it was a law at this time that you had to write "Welcome to my homepage" on your website. And you'll see something else there, that font size, the font tag. So this was the only way to control typography, was to wrap every element of your phrasing content within a font tag, and then you could specify a size, and here is 3, and there were 6 sizes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. A color, and you had access to 256 colors, which were the so-called web safe colors at the time. And then you had access to your kind of 6 web fonts, the standard Arial, Verdana, Tahoma, Courier, etc. And then of course the obligatory "Welcome to my homepage." And this would create for you this wonderful, amazing piece of design. So all of that, and this is what it gets you. It's not easy. It's to make anything that looks decent at this point in time. But we had some highly complex layouts that were built using tables. For example, this is the Wired magazine from 1998, and you can see here there are certain things that that you have no control over. So link color, for example, that's not something you can change. That's still the standard old link color that we have available now if we don't style our links. But with things like background color on tables, table layouts, and so on, you were able to create what looked like a decent layout. But again, this is still very much let's force print conventions into the web. So all the people who are suddenly designing for the web generally came from a print background and tried to shoehorn those print conceptions into the screen. Just interesting, if you look at the special reports on the right of Microsoft in trouble with antitrust people in 1998, and that was because of Internet Explorer version 1. Right, so after that we then got CSS, and CSS version 1 was published as a draft for the first time in October 1994 by Hakam Lee, who went on to form Opera, the browser company Opera, but has been very involved with the W3C for a long time. But there were around 10 other proposals for style sheets, other than this one. And this initial proposal was presented at a web conference in Chicago in November 1994. There was a lot of argument about it. Some people thought that CSS, as it was being presented, was too simple. They wanted a full programming language that was needed, but CSS actually went into the opposite direction, and it was very clear that it would be a simple and declarative format always. And the major driving concern behind that was what we've come to know as separation of concerns, that our styling and our markup exist independently of each other, which is kind of being blurred a little bit now with JavaScript frameworks and things like that, but that's another discussion. Right, so in 1995, the W3C became a thing, and there was a workshop in Paris, and style sheets were the main topic. That was in 1995. And one of the people there was a very influential person at Microsoft called Thomas Reardon, who was in charge of Internet Explorer at the time, and he pledged support for CSS in IE. And IE3 was released in August 1996, and it was the first browser to have a kind of very rudimentary implementation of CSS. That was quickly followed by Netscape, which was the other browser of the time. And then, Opera also arrived on the scene around that same time. But the first browsers to support CSS version 1 was in fact IE for Mac in the year 2000. And that was the old IE Trident engine. It did not follow any standards whatsoever, but it did support CSS. That was also the last version of IE for Mac that ever existed 20 years ago. Okay, so while CSS has become a thing at this point, the table layouts are still very much the thing. And then there's this other technology called Flash, which you may be familiar with. I actually opened a browser this morning and got a pop-up from Adobe saying, please uninstall Flash. I don't know if anyone has seen that. It comes to end of its life is the end of this year, which is quite a momentous occasion because Flash was a big deal. Right, so this is the kind of thing that layout that people started doing. And this is from 2003, and this is Caliber 10,000, which is kind of this legendary site where it was called the Designer's Lunchbox, and it was a design portal that was kind of meticulously put together, pixel by pixel, as you can see, highly influential style, very groundbreaking. And it created kind of a whole new user interface language. Like we saw buttons that were styled for the first time. We saw typography being used that had never been done before. And there was a lot of humor, a lot of personality, and so on. And this was a combination of Flash, tables, and CSS. So the layout is generally still in tables, but there's a lot of Flash components, and we're also starting to see CSS starting to make an impact. And if we just zoom in here on the left, we can see the issue requirements, and each issue had a requirement. This particular one needed IE version 5 or Netscape Navigator 6, Flash, but you were okay if you didn't have QuickTime. So, great. Okay, so then after this kind of thing, which as I say was very influential, still table layouts, but a lot of Flash, a lot of interactivity, animations, and so on. We then moved into CSS layouts, and in particular, what was called fluid layout. And this was very simply sizing in percentages rather than pixels. So if the screen size changed, the proportion of elements would stay the same. This is not responsive design, although responsive design does, as one of its tenets, uses this principle. But the crucial thing here was that table layouts were replaced with floats, so we went from a giant hack of data tables for layout to another giant hack of floats for layout, because floats were never intended for layout. They were intended to make text, float around an image. That's it. That was their intention. Until someone did something, probably by mistake, and suddenly we had float-based layouts. Okay. So that was a fluid layout. And then this was replaced, but kind of went in tandem for a while with a fixed layout, which was fixed width sizing in pixels. Okay, so not percentages, but pixels. And I'm sure we've all done this at some point. Sidebar float left width 300 pixels, content float right width 900 pixels, or whatever it might be. So we had that, and the width stayed the same independently of which screen size or resolution the viewer has. And again, this was replacing table layouts with floats. So I just want to go back to this this image here, and I'm going to, of Caliber 10,000, remember this is 2003, and I'm going to zoom in again and look at this ad for designing with web standards by Jeffrey Zeldman. Okay, so Jeffrey Zeldman is considered to be kind of the forerunner in the web standards movement, and this was a movement launched in 1998, coincided with the launch of CSS Level 2, And the book, Designing with Web Standards, was published in 2003. And this was very much a movement to prioritize separation of concerns. Our HTML is for markup, our CSS is for styling. You know, JavaScript at this point is just an afterthought. Yeah, it exists, but it's not really used for much on the front end. And the web standards movement was like, let's replace all these table-based layouts with floats. We shouldn't be designing with tables, and so on. And that's what the book looks like. And that is Jeffrey Zeldman on the cover. And you see he's wearing a blue beanie. And there's now something called Blue Beanie Day, which is a yearly celebration of web standards where you're supposed to write your HTML and CSS, and I guess now also your JavaScript, while wearing a blue beanie. Of course, it's in the summer in the Southern Hemisphere, so, who's going to do that? Okay, but two really important things happened in 2001, where two major high-profile websites launched redesigns that were built without table layouts, and they're built entirely with web standards, which I kind of quibble with a little bit because using a float for layout is not a web standard. But anyway, and the first one was ESPN, and this was the site, 2001. So this was entirely done with floats, no table layouts at all. And it was a major website, really huge amounts of traffic were going to it. And they did a very interesting study on performance, which I think is one of the first performance studies that was ever done, comparing their float-based layouts to their table-based layouts in terms of rendering times and so on. And remember also 2001, no one's got 100 meg broadband, right? So web standards was also a performance-based imperative. And the second one was Wired. Again, Wired, Wired has always been very much at the forefront of design on their actual site. And this was also in 2001. So those were very important things that started this movement away from tables and into float-based layouts. And float-based layouts stayed with us for a long time. And to some extent, they're still with us. And they actually became one of the tenets of responsive design. Responsive design is now 10 years old, even though it seems pretty new most of the time. But 10 years ago, an Ethan Marcotte presented at an event apart. At Invent Apart, coincidentally founded by Jeffrey Zeldman, as is a list apart and a book apart, which I'm sure people are familiar with. And there were a couple of things that made this a thing. The first one was a flexible grid, which was greatly pretty much the same as fluid design, except now we had some other CSS properties that helped, like box sizing, and we had a lot better browser support for CSS standards. So we had a flexible grid, and then we had flexible images, and this was a massive breakthrough. For the first time, CSS was used to resize images by the max width of 100% and height auto. And that was a major new thing. And then the next new thing was, of course, media queries and using media queries as breakpoints, which again is kind of hacky, right? It's not what media queries were intended for. And then there was one huge, just like the Wired and the ESPN sites gave us float-based layouts instead of tables. There was a very high-profile redesign of the Boston Globe website that was really the first really large responsive website. And it was done by Ethan Marcotte himself in collaboration with the Filament Group, who are well known for their work on standards and performance in particular. Okay, so but we're still with floated layouts. We're still floating things. We're still, having to clear things. We're still having to use the clear fix hack and all that stuff. And it's all very hacky. Now, floated layouts are fine when you've got something like that and everything is the same size. That's not a problem. You know, you just float it left and you give it a margin and off you go. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it works fine. Where floated layouts don't work is when you have things that are of different heights, because an item is automatically going to go and take up, remember when we float something, it's taken outside of our normal block flow layout. And so it wants to take up the space that's missing. And we get something like this. So we have to write some nasty CSS, you know, where we go and use nth of types and things like that. And we switch margins off and we clear on the left and so on, just to make sure that if things are different heights, that they're in place. And then we wanted this to be responsive. So then we have to bring in a whole bunch of media queries where we are resetting margins and clears on some things and not on others. And that's just for a tablet. And then we've got to do a phone. And then we're writing all sorts of real nasty stuff, which deserves an emoji and another emoji. And then we just go, well, this is really making me cry. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to download Bootstrap. And then we download Bootstrap. Remember, this is Bootstrap like 3 or 2 or whatever. And Bootstrap just makes us feel like this, because we need to write a CS declaration with the specificity of like 120 just to change the color of a button. Now, I'm aware that Bootstrap is a lot better now, but I'm talking about at this particular era. And then the other thing that you get is you get these sarcastic comments on Twitter by non-designers who say things like, which of the 2 possible websites are you currently designing? Which hurts, you know, it hurts. But I would posit that this kind of tweet, obviously it's a joke, you know, it's tongue-in-cheek, etc. And we did certainly have a lot of, no, we still do have a lot of, you know, similarity on the web. But I don't think that's a design flaw. It's rather a flaw with the tools that we have for layout. If we are constrained so much by how we can do layout, then we are going to come up with things that work easily and are easily reproducible, especially if we're trying to look at a component-based system. So I think this tweet's a little disingenuous in a sense. You know, sure, websites do start to look the same, but it's not because they're being designed that way necessarily. It's because of the limitations of the tools. Right. Fortunately, we're getting away from this. So now we have what we can call components of the new layout. And this encompasses a whole bunch of different things. The first thing is Flexbox, which has been around for ages. And I would guess that most people involved in front end are very familiar with Flexbox and know how it works and have used it extensively. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on Flexbox. The second thing is Grid, and Grid has now been usable for about 18 months. There was a sudden flurry towards the end of 2019 where we suddenly had all the browsers supporting it. Yeah. Then we have box alignment or alignment. So alignment started as part of the Flexbox specification, where we had things like justify content and align items and so on. But that has now been removed out of the Flexbox spec, and it is a spec on its own. And the reason for this is that alignment is now going to be applicable to all sorts of display properties. So alignment now lives on its own, and we can specify alignment properties on elements that are display flex, display grid. Coming soon, display block. So your plain old display block elements are going to be able to work with alignment properties, and also, you know, things like tables. We have now what is called intrinsic sizing, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that is about allowing sizing to rigorously follow your content rather than forcing your content into a size. that's predetermined. We have logical properties, which is a different way of dealing with margins, borders, padding, positioning, and so on. We have object fit, which allows us to, if you've ever had to shoehorn a background image into something so that it scales responsively, we can now do that within the HTML itself. We have writing modes for changing orientation for different languages. This is very exciting to me, and I'll show you some examples of this. And we have shapes and masking, where we can now flow text around irregular shapes rather than just rectangles. And then, of course, we've got all the other CSS properties we've always used. They haven't gone away. They're perfectly usable, and we really shouldn't be discarding them. There tends to be a sense that, oh, we've got all this new stuff now, let's ignore the old stuff. But there's so many useful things in older versions of CSS that we should never get rid of. And the other thing that often I see people getting confused about, I'm not sure if that's the case yet with this audience, but that grid replaces Flexbox. Let me try that again. That grid replaces Flexbox. You know, this is not the case. It's not one or the other. They are complementary to each other. So there's nothing stopping you from having a Flexbox element inside a grid container, or a grid element inside a Flexbox container. So they work extremely well together. All right, so let's get into it, these things. So Flexbox versus grid. I'm saying versus here as in, you know, a comparison, not that they are fighting with each other in any way. Okay, so the important thing for Flexbox is simply that Flexbox is one-dimensional. So it's either a row, and that is the default, and Flex works really well where you have elements of different sizes, or it's a column. So flex direction column, which you must explicitly set. Okay, so row default if you don't specify anything, and if you want a column, you must specify a column. But one-dimensional, you can't have both of them, yeah? Which makes Flex not good for grids, for creating grids. Although before we had good support for grid, Flexbox was often used to create grids, but that was done with a whole lot of kind of hacky things like negative margins and all sorts of calc properties and trying to make it work in IE 11. Yeah, not so great. So Flexbox is perfect for something like this, where you have a simple site header, where you might have a menu on the left and a login link on the right. And we might have some HTML, and it looks like this, where we've just got a header with a class. We've got 3 links for our menu, and we have a class of login for our login item. And as soon as we say display flex on this, all of these items will be lined up in a row. Yeah? So everything will be horizontal, just with that one item. And we can align them in the center, just with the line item center, display flex and flex wrap, which means as the screen gets smaller, the items will just wrap. And to position that login on the right, we can simply give it a margin left of water. And we're done. So, you know, what would have been with floats, we would have had to wrap those items in separate containers, float them left, float one right. We would have had to have a clear fix hack on the container, because as soon as you float something, the parent gets collapsed. You probably have to put in a guess at some padding to center it vertically, and so on and so on. So Flex becomes very useful for these types of items. Okay, Grid, on the other hand, introduces a 2-dimensional grid system to CSS, whereas Flex is 1-dimensional, Grid is 2-dimensional. And grids can be used to lay out major page areas or small user interface elements. Yeah. So with Flexbox, we generally want to use on small user interface elements, like headers, like menus, like cards, and things like that. Grid allows us to lay out an entire page or screen with ease. So what is a grid? Oh, I just quickly here, grid actually started life 10 years ago, well, almost 10 years ago in 2011. And it took that long to get it going. And it was a proposal started by Microsoft at the CSS working group. But it took about 8 years to get into browsers because it's a difficult problem to solve, you know, how you represent this visually. So what is a grid? And I don't mean a grid in the kind of philosophical existential sense, but a grid in CSS. And it's very simply an intersecting set of horizontal and vertical lines. One defines columns and the other defines rows. And you can place elements onto the grid respecting these column and row lines. So I think I have this slide twice. Oh, I do. Okay, so grids has some features. So you can have fixed or flexible track sizes. So you can, for example, create a grid with a column that is fixed in pixels, or you can create ones that are flexible using percentages, or with the new fractional unit, which has been designed for this purpose. And I'll talk about that later. And you can place items onto a grid using line numbers, using names, or by targeting a grid area. And grid also has an algorithm that controls items that are not given an explicit position on the grid. So if you just say, give me 3 columns and you don't specify a row, and you've got 12 items, the grid algorithm will just automatically create the rows based on the number of children. You don't have to explicitly specify that. Yeah, so item placement I've dealt with, and then creation of additional tracks to hold content. So you can declare a grid, and additional rows and columns are just added as needed, as I mentioned. Within the constraints of your container, of course. Yeah. So alignment control, so I already mentioned alignment. So grid has access to all the things in the alignment spec, and you can control where items are placed and then also how they are aligned. And you can have more than one item in a grid cell. So you can have items that overlap each other or partially overlap each other, and that's layering is controlled by Z-index. So if you've ever had to do absolute positioning because you need to put some text on top of an image, and you've had to set position relative, and then you've had to set position absolute on that text, and then you have to figure out, well, where does it go? And what if it's 2 lines? And what if it wraps? And what if this happens and that happens and your positioning is all over the place? A grid solves all those problems just with a simple placement and alignment property. Right, so creating a grid. This is really easy. You just do this, display a grid, and it's done. Of course, once you have done that and you might have a bunch of children in there, nothing is going to happen. Okay, it's still going to look like a block layout, with one exception, collapsing margins. So in CSS, we have the concept of collapsing margins, where if you have an item in your flow layout that is set to block and it has a bottom margin, and directly after that you have an item that is block and it has a top margin, those margins will cancel each other out. Okay. That can be frustrating, but it's there for a particular reason, and that reason is for textual content, which was initially what the web was, was just going to be a document repository. It wasn't going to be, Spotify. And so collapsing margins were a good thing because they allowed paragraph spacing to be uniform. So grid, once you say display grid, your margins will no longer collapse. But as soon as we say display grid, all direct children of that container become what is called a grid item. And we can then specify, okay, well, what should our grid look like? And we do that via the grid template columns and grid template rows of properties. So display grid template columns, and this is just a simple one, 200, 200, 200. and then rows 200, 200. And this is going to give us 3 columns of 200 pixels each and 2 rows of 200 pixels each. And this is really the representation. Okay, so because we've specified 3 times 200, we're only ever going to have 3 columns. They're always going to be 200 pixels wide. If we have 5 items, as we have here, they will just go to the next row. Okay. And the row is also specified as 2 items. But note that we get these numbered lines. Okay, we get these numbered lines. So for 3 columns, we're always going to have 4 numbered lines, and for 2 rows, we're always going to have 3 numbered lines. And those are what we use to do placement. Okay. So we have 2 rows and 3 columns, but we have, we have 2 rows and 3 line rows, and 3 columns and 4 column lines. Okay, and then we also have, so here's something where we might have 5 columns and 5 rows, and you'll see our line numbers, and we also have the negative, the inverse of those numbers as well, which we can use for placement. So if we have a complex layout and something I've just made up that might look like this, where we have a whole bunch of items that overlap, that fill different spaces, have different widths, different heights, we can easily do this in grid by setting up our grid columns and then using our placement techniques to do that. So if we just look at the blue block in the top row, the first one, the large one, to place that in our grid, we would simply say div column start 2, and you'll see it starts on column 2, and grid column end 4. So that would mean start on line 2, end at line 4, and then for our row, start on grid row line 1 and end on grid row line 2. And we have a bunch of shorthand properties as well that we can use. So for example, for that we could say for the row 1 start and then span 1. So that's just spanning 1 row. And for column we could say start on line 2 and then span 2 more columns. So it would end on number 4. Okay, so now these are fairly straightforward and simple examples. Grid is a lot more complicated than this, and there are a lot more properties, but for the interest of time, I can't, I'm not going to be able to go through all of those, but I'll point you to good places to read up on all of this. Okay, the other important thing about grid is what we call the FR unit, and this is called the fractional unit, and it's a flexible unit in the same way that VW, VH, and M and REM are. It only works with grid. We can't use it anywhere else. Okay, it will only work on grid, and it will only work to lay out our grid itself, so for sizing our columns and rows. So it's a flexible length unit. It's specific to grid layout, and it can't be combined with ordinary units via calc. So we can't do something like calc 1FR minus 2M. Okay, that's not going to happen. But when we're setting up our grid template columns, we can mix our FRs with fixed units, and we can also mix them with relative and flexible units. And 1FR is equal to 1 part of the available space. Right? So if we say something like this, grid template columns 3 rem, 1FR, 1FR, we would then have 3 columns. The first one would be fixed at 3 rem, and then we would have 2 equally spaced columns that take up the rest of the space of that particular div. Now, we could say 2FR and 1FR, or whatever we want to make that up. And the same with the rows. We would have a row at the top that is fixed at 300, a row at the bottom that is fixed at 200, and then whatever space is then left will be taken up by our middle row. This is actually a great way to lay out a body. I use it all the time, where on the body I said, okay, how tall is my header? How tall is my footer? Specify those, and then 1FR for the body. And that will just expand or contract as required, which works really well. It also means that your footer is always going to be fixed at the bottom of the screen without any nasty positioning things. Okay, we can also create auto grids via the repeat function. And this allows us to do responsive layouts without media queries. So the repeat function allows you to repeat as many columns as needed. And we then have auto fill and auto fit, which do slightly different things. So auto fill will fill the rows with as many columns as it can fit, while auto fit will fit the currently available columns into the space by expanding them. Okay, so slightly different there, both useful. Okay, then we have the min-max function, where we can say, yeah, this must be no smaller than this, but no larger than this. Auto fit and auto fill, I've already spoken about. And then we have the gap property, which allows us to place spaces between elements. And this has also just recently become available for Flexbox as well. And I'll show an example of that later. So creating, a repeating grid would look something like this: display grid template columns repeats. So, create as many as you need, auto fill up the available space, min max. You can't be smaller than 250 pixels, but you can't be wider than 1 fractional unit. And then put in a gap of 1 rem. And this becomes a perfectly responsive grid without a single media query because of our min-max property and our autofill property. And I'll show an example of this in action. Okay, so I've mentioned alignment, and this is the box alignment spec, which now lives on its own. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. So I'm sure you've all heard this thing, right? There are only 2 hard things in computer science: naming things and cache invalidation. Well, actually there are 3. And the third one is vertically and horizontally centering elements in CSS. This has been a bugbear of everyone forever. And, I can't tell you how many blog posts there are on how to do this and how many weird techniques with negative transforms and absolute positioning and all sorts of stuff, to do something as simple as that. So alignment, one of the things that, that everyone jumped on with Flex in particular and alignment is that we can do this in 3 lines, like that, by setting it a Flex display property on something and then going align item center and justify content center. And everything inside that div in this case would be vertically and horizontally aligned. We can actually do it in 2 lines of CSS by going display flex and then margin auto. And margin auto in Flex will just say create equal margins. Right, so, and just before I go into this, indebted to Rachel Andrew, the link here on box alignment. I think all of us are indebted to Rachel Andrew for the work she's done on Grid and Flexbox, and as part of the CSS working group. So alignment occurs on 2 axes. We have what is the inline axis, and this is horizontal. And that is justify contents, justify items, and justify self, as in all the justifiers. And then we have the block axis, which is vertical. And here we have align content, align items, and align self. And these all have a bunch of different values. So alignment values. So we have positional alignment, keywords such as start, end, and center. So align items, flex end, for example. We have baseline alignment. with baseline, last baseline, and first baseline, and distributed alignment with things like space between, space around, and latterly, but not good browser support, space evenly. I've got examples again of this to show. All right. So the other important thing we have with new layout is gap. Now, up until now, if we wanted to create space between elements, we had to use margins. And generally that meant negative margins on a container and then weird clearing and all sorts of hard stuff like that. Even with Flexbox, up until recently, if you wanted to create some kind of a grid, you generally had to use a negative margin and then a flex basis where you would use calc to subtract that margin from a percentage width or something like that, which was never great. But gap removes all of these problems. So the gap property is a shorthand for row gap and column gap, and it specifies the size of the space between rows and columns, which we commonly refer to as the getter. This is an old print term that makes its way into these kind of things. And this is available within grid, flex, and also multi-column layouts. So CSS columns. Again, I'll show some examples of this. And gap is specified as either a length or a percentage, and it can take a number of units of measure. Okay, so I'll show some examples of this. And gap will also come to block elements at some point. So we will start getting away from using margins for spacing, which can only be a good thing. Right. So intrinsic sizing. So this is another key concept in CSS layout. And what we're really looking at is extrinsic versus intrinsic dimensions. So CSS 3 introduced the concept of intrinsic dimensions, which is the opposite of extrinsic, obviously. An extrinsic dimension of a box is always calculated on the box's parent. Yeah. So for example, width 80% is an extrinsic dimension, as the width of that subject depends on its containing box. So if you have an item inside a parent and you say that item must be 80%, it's going to be 80% of its parent's size. Okay, so contrary to that, we have width in new CSS with min content, max content, fit content, and stretch. Okay, and these are intrinsic to the dimensions of the content itself, not to its parent. And that's a very, very crucial distinction. So we have these things, min content, max content, fit content, and strength, and stretch. So if we say min content on something, then we're saying that that item must only be as big as its actual content. So if we have one word, let's say the word word, the container will only be that wide. Yeah? So we would say width min content for this. Max content, we would say, you can be as wide as you need to be. Fit content says, fit this within the parent, so that's slightly different. And then stretch is quite similar to flex, grow, as in fill up all the stuff that you need, but it's not supported in any browsers yet. Right, so these are all width properties. So we add them to the width property. So max content is our preferred width, okay? It's a little bit like max width, okay? Min content that's purely the intrinsic minimum width. Fit content, fit to parent, and stretch is not available yet. Okay, again, we'll look at some examples of these. Right, so, Masonry. Pinterest, when Pinterest first came out, I don't know when, 15? No, earlier than that. They had this, like, all their cards on the home page, and they all fit into these columns and rows, where there was no space despite the height of an element. And this became a big thing. People wrote all sorts of JavaScript in order to enable this and create these kinds of things, and it was positioning everything absolutely, and about 1 million media queries to make it responsive, and plugins like David DeSandro's Masonry plugin and Isotope and all these things. But we now have a Masonry property as part of grid. And it's a layout method where one axis uses a normal grid layout, usually columns, and the other uses a Masonry layout. So we create our columns, and then we set our rows or our columns to be Masonry, as in full up space where you need to. And we do that via grid template rows Masonry or grid template columns Masonry. Now, there's some debate about whether this is in fact a grid thing or not, and whether it's suitable to CSS grid, as it's kind of taking away those structural elements around rows and columns as initially envisaged. So there's some basic debate around that. At the moment, it's only available in Firefox, and it's also available only behind the flag. That has to be enabled. Now, I'll show an example of this as well. Right, logical properties, which I mentioned before. So logical properties control layout through logical rather than physical dimensions and mapping. Okay, and these are closely related to writing modes. So instead of using, margin top, we use a logical property for margin top, and logical properties and values use the terms block and inline to describe directional flow, and the computed values of those terms is determined by the writing mode. And again, I'll show some examples of this. So for block, we're talking about a vertical dimension, and that's perpendicular in horizontal writing modes like English, and inline, we're talking about a horizontal dimension or parallel in horizontal writing modes. So instead of margin top 10 pixels, we would say margin block start 10 pixels. And that means if we switch our writing modes, we're not losing the orientation of our layout and spacing properties. Okay, so that becomes a little bit clearer when we look at examples, which we are going to do now. Okay, let me just get this. Can everyone see the browser? Yes, okay. All right, so I'll just put some examples here, and I intend to turn this into a much larger thing. As you can see, I've got all these coming soon. Yeah. Okay. So box alignment. So let's look at some examples here. So box alignments, how alignment works and identifies methods for the inline axis, justify content, etc. Block, I mentioned that as well already. And let's just look at a couple of examples. So the first one here is, around spare space. So we've got a container here. It has display flex, and it is flex wrap. And what we want to do is we want to create space between these items. And to do that, we're going to say, we're going to use justify content space between, and we're going to use align content space between. Now you'll notice that in Flexbox, an item will become as high as its highest element. Okay. So in this case, we have 2 lines here, and you'll note that all the items that are on that axis in this position assume that height, but this one that is wrapped doesn't. Okay. So Flexbox is not going to suddenly make this the same height. And note that they're all different widths as well, because by default, when we say display flex, our flex basis is set to auto. Okay, so I'm just going to switch on these two classes here and you'll see what happens. Okay, so now once we've done that, we've set space between for justify, and that's on our inline axis. And you'll see now we have this spacing between our elements and they've lost some of their width, right? And then align content, we're saying, let's create space in our block elements, and then in our block axis, and there again, we've seen that space that occurs here. Okay, now these aren't the only options that you have here. You have space around, you have space evenly, you have center, and so on. Those are all documented really, really well by Rachel Andrew on her website. Okay, now grid works a little bit differently, I should say. So here we have a grid, and we've just done a really simple template. We've got 3 columns, and they're 300 pixels each. If I go into my inspector in Firefox, wherever I have a grid item, it will tell me, and I can actually click on that, and it will show me my grid lines. So remember earlier I was talking about how grid lines are created, and we can see here we've got 3 columns, so we've got 4 grid line columns, and we haven't specified a row, but the grid will automatically create rows as required. Okay, so we don't need to specify that, and you'll see we've got 2 rows because we've got 4 items, and we've only got 3 columns. Okay, in Firefox, you can also go to the Layout tab, and you'll see that it's showing our grid items as they are. And you can then go and see which one is aligned where, and so on. Okay, so with grid, we're now going to justify content space between, and we're going to align content space between, and you'll see what happens. Is that our grid items retain their width because we specified that at 300 pixels, but the grid now expands to fill the container. So if we just go and inspect that again, and we turn on our grid lines, and we see what happens, we now have all that extra space that is being created between our elements because they are only that wide. Okay. If we had said 1FR, for example, 1 fractional unit, there would be no space between these items. Okay, so that is, creating space between elements, yeah, and that's generally happens on both the inline and the block axis. But sometimes what we want to do is we want to move things around. So here we've got our flex container again. We flex wrap, but now what we want to do is we want to align our items to flex end. So let's see what happens when we turn this on. You see what happens there is we're moving elements to the baseline. Okay, we're moving elements to the baseline via our flex end because we're saying align items, and that is moving in our block axis. We can also inspect this in Firefox, and there is a flex button, and that'll show your flex layout, and then you can select each of the items within that. And it tells you, well, it's a row and it's wrap, and you can actually turn that off, turn the grid items on and off here. Very useful. Okay, for grid, slightly different. We've got the same grid item, but now we're going to align items center. So we're going to use our align property, which, if we remember, is our block axis. So we're going to align them vertically, and we're going to justify them center. So we're also going to put them in the middle. And see what happens here is our grid items are now centered within relation to the parent. They still retain their 300 pixels width, and you'll see that there's equal space on either side at the top and the bottom because we've aligned them center. So our grid itself is vertically and horizontally centered. As we can see there, there's the middle of our grid. And because we have some padding on this element, that's what's causing that. Okay, so grid gap, as I mentioned, is shorthand for row and column, and we can have these either a single length value where we can say gap 16 pixels, and that is then applied everywhere to row and column. We can say to AM, we can say EM, so we can say 5 V min, it doesn't matter. Okay, we can use all those characters here. We can even use things we hardly ever would use in CSS, like inches and centimeters, which are CSS units of measure, actually. So, or we can have, oh, there's a typo, yikes, double length, whatever. I'll fix that. We can have a double length value. So if we said 16 pixels, 32 pixels, it's a row and then a column first. And again, the things we can have a percentage values, single and a double, and we can also have calc values. So we can also use calc to create gaps. As I said earlier, this is now applicable in Flexbox. So we can create nice spacing in our Flexbox items. And again, let's just go to our inspector. Let's turn on our Flex, and you can see there the gaps. And if I turn off that gap, you can see the items line up next to each other. Turn on the gap and 2 rem, and there it is. And that's the only CSS to create that, which is great. Grid, here's another example. Again, I'll just go and turn on my inspector. With our grid, you see we've got our 3 columns as usual, and our 2 rows. And then we're creating a grid of 2 rem between our rows, our columns and our rows. Turn it off, and we have no gap. Turn it on, and there it is. Super useful. And you'll notice that there's no gap before the grid element or before the Flexbox element. It's only between the children. Whereas if we had to do margins, we'd have weird margins overlapping and all sorts of stuff like that. Now, something else that we can use gap is with CSS column. A CSS column is really great, especially for text, and I think it gets really ignored a lot. People don't really use it much that I see. But we can create our columns very, very simply, just column count 3. Yeah, and that gives us 3 columns. This HTML is a single paragraph. It's just a single paragraph. If I turn that column count off, you can see there's our single paragraph. Turn it on, oh, we've got that, and then a gap of 40 pixels, which we can set as we like. Column is really useful for textual elements. Okay, so that's gap. All right, logical properties. So logical properties I mentioned before, and these replace our standard physical dimension properties. So instead of margin, padding, border, positioning, all this kinds of stuff, we are replacing those with now logical properties. And we have block for vertical and inline for horizontal. Now there are a lot of these, so I haven't documented them all here. But here, for example, block size would correspond to either width or height, depending on the writing mode, right? So in standard CSS, we might say to something, okay, I want you to be 100 pixels high. Now, as soon as you change the writing mode from horizontal to vertical, how does that height calculate itself? Okay. It doesn't become a width, it remains a height. And that causes all sorts of layout problems when we change writing modes. Block size, however, will switch based on the writing mode. So it can be a width or a height. It's the same with inline size. It can be a width or a height. Inline size is replacing, in horizontal writing mode, what we would call a width. And then we can do max block size, max inline size, min, and block size, and min inline size. Okay, I'm not going to go through all these in detail because we don't have time. And then there are properties for margin and border and padding. And you can see there's a ton of these here. And I actually only included about a third of them. Okay, but there's a handy link to all the values on MDN for a list. But here what we're doing is we're replacing our border properties, where we might write border top, border left, border right, because what happens when we switch writing modes to vertical is those borders no longer respect that particular element the way we want it to. And it's the same with margin and padding. So margin block start in horizontal writing modes would be margin top, but in vertical writing modes, it would be margin right. Okay, so we need, vertical right to left, it would be margin right. So these are what we should start to be using rather than our standard margins, padding, border things. And then there's also a bunch more for positioning, for overflow, for scrolling. If you think about overflow right now, I mean, overflow is either vertical or horizontal. But what happens again if we have vertical overflow and we switch our writing mode? The vertical overflow still remains vertical, whereas it should now be horizontal, and it should maybe be going from right to left. The same with positioning. We now absolutely position something and we say, oh, left 10 pixels, top 15, or whatever it might be. Again, we switch our writing mode and those are all out of whack. So we have now something called inset for that, which works much, much better. Okay, now it used to be quite painful to use these because there were no shorthand properties like we have with, padding, for example, 1 rem, 2 rem, which would be, top, bottom, right and left. But as of Chrome 87, which is relatively recent, we now have support for shorthand. Gee, I'm finding lots of typos. So the long way we had to write it would have been like padding block start 1 rem, which would be in horizontal mode, padding top, and padding block end, which would have been padding bottom. But now we can write padding block 1 rem. Or if we have different values, we can write padding block 1 rem, 2 rem for that. And then the same with padding inline start, padding inline end, and so on. We just now could just write padding inline. And then the writing mode property, I'm missing 2 things here. Sorry, it should say vertical. So that's horizontal top to bottom. There should also be vertical left to right and vertical right to left. I'll add those. Determines the direction in the block flow. So I'm just going to show an example here. So I've got 2 containers here, and you'll see they each have different border colors. And this one has padding top of 50 pixels, and this one has padding block start of 50 pixels. And they look identical, because right now we're in horizontal top to bottom mode, which is what we're used to in English. But if we change this to vertical left to right, you'll see what's going to happen. So padding block start 50 pixels is now represented correctly as 50 pixels over here. Whereas this one still has 50 pixels at the top. And that's actually pushed that down. It essentially becomes like left padding in horizontal writing. And you'll note the borders have also changed orientation. And if we do right to left, we see the same issue, where our padding top here is still showing that. And it's best if we inspect it. And you can see there the padding is at the top, whereas on this one, the padding is on block start, which in right to left, vertical right to left is on the right. So this allows us to do layouts where we can cater for many different languages and writing modes without having to have 2 separate sets of markup and things like that for spacing and orientation. And it just makes sense. And once you start using it, you start to realize how intuitive it is, because we're working with block and inline, which is our perfect kind of flow elements that we've always been happy using. Okay, so earlier in the slides, I showed an example of setting up a repeating grid with repeat, autofill, and min-max, and this is an example of what this might look like. So here my screen is quite big. So I've set up a grid, and I'm just going to inspect it again. I guess I should bump this up here. Let me do that a bit more. So here we've got our grid template columns, and we're saying repeat. So just keep going. Autofill, fill the space, but you can't be an item within this grid can't be wider than 250 pixels. I mean, can't be smaller than 250 pixels, and it can't be wider than 1 fractional unit. If I turn that off, we just get a bunch of divs one under the other. Okay. So I'm just going to go into responsive mode, and you can see as I resize here, this grid and this image gallery is going to automatically resize and flow to take up the available space until we get right down to, phone, what's a phone, like 375. Okay, and that's happening without any media queries at all, and that's purely because of our repeat, autofill, and min-max function. So that's a really great way to create this kind of thing with grid. As you can see, as we go wider, it just fills up as it needs to, and as we go smaller, things automatically wrap. And we're still in responsive mode. Okay, so here we're looking at a more complex grid, and in this case, what I've done is I've set up a grid which is simply saying repeat our columns 4 times and make them all 1 FR. And then what we're doing is, if we look at a specific element, is we're saying grid row start span 2 and grid column start span 2. So we're saying to this particular element, I want you to start on 1 and then span 2 and so on. And we do that for all of these. And so we can go and create these elements just by placing items as we want on a particular grid. And like again, there are no media queries here, and it doesn't, excuse me, it's not great, but you could add a media query at some points to just go and turn that into a normal block item. So again, that's the advantages of grid, in being able to place things exactly where we want to. Okay, the last thing I want to show is Masonry. So here we have a Masonry layout where we've just got a whole bunch of divs, and I was very lazy here, so I just gave them a block size as a style attribute in the actual HTML. Of course, you wouldn't do that. This is purely for demonstration purposes. So I'm giving them a block size, and remember that's one of our logical properties, so that's giving each of these a height. Yeah, so I'm just giving them a height, and our grid itself, again, we're doing a repeat with autofill, min-max, and we've got 300 pixels wide and 1 FR. So let's just turn on our grid overlay, and we can see that we've got our 5 columns. Our 4 columns. That's automatically created by grid because our container itself is 1,200 pixels wide, and we've specified to repeat 4 times, a maximum of 300. And then our rows are just created automatically via the Masonry example that we have. So here we're saying repeat, autofill, etc., and then grid template rows, Masonry. And that causes these elements to now fill space where required. And that is creating something that needs highly complex JavaScript and absolute positioning up to now with literally, couple of lines of CSS. So at the moment, Masonry is only available in Firefox behind a flag. You have to go to about config and set this flag to true, and then it will work. If I open this in Chrome, it's all broken. So this is Masonry columns, but as I said, we can also do Masonry rows, where we apply an inline size to the children, and there we can go grid template columns Masonry and make our rows something else. And you can see how that is now working, where the rows have equal height, whereas here the columns have equal width, and then the columns are stacked to take up remaining space. Okay, so now I intend to add more stuff to this that I haven't spoken about, like spanning items. So you can span an item across rows and columns within Masonry itself. You can set up autoflow, you can align and justify as well. And what's also interesting is that this is fully responsive. There we go, with no media queries. So it's my code thing that's messing that up. Yeah, so this will flow based on the size of the container and just be fully responsive without any media queries. Okay, I'm still going to add shape, sizing, and subgrids to this. Like subgrids, you may have heard of. It's applying at the moment. If you apply a grid to a parent, then everything within that grid becomes subject to those grid properties. Subgrid allows you to create nested grids, which makes a big difference because you are no longer constrained by what you have set on the parent. Okay, so those are the examples. Yeah, so I'm almost done. So the era of intrinsic design is something that was coined by Jane Simmons to describe, kind of a new era of layout on the web, with layout now being an integral part of CSS and no longer a hack. And all the things I've been speaking about talk to that. And then this is a slide I have in every talk I get give about 3 things changing the web: service worker, variable fonts, and CSS layout, with just giving us so many more opportunities than we had before. The web's a fluid medium, and we broke that with all those fixed widths and tables and flash movies and all that kind of stuff. But now we have an opportunity to fix that and get back to designing for the medium itself, rather than trying to make it emulate something that it's not. Okay, so if you're going to make things that thrive in any context, we must embrace and accept the fact that the web is not a fixed medium. Designers don't like it when I say this. Anyway, some links, I'll post them in the chat, and yeah, that's it.
Cool, thanks a lot, Justin. That was super informative. I have seen a lot of the stuff before, but I do like the updates. There's a lot of new content there. This is very much, I think between this and the talk on fonts, this is very much turning into your life's work at this point, because I'm kind of just seeing it grow every year and year. So hopefully one day we're going to get the CSS layout definitive edition by Book Apart from Justin Slack.
Andrew's already written that one.
What, a layout one?
Yeah, CSS layout. It's a
Oh,
couple of years old now, though. It's out of date.
okay. I know the CSS one, which I think is Jeremy Keith.
Jeremy Keith did HTML5,
Oh,
and
okay.
Ethan Marcotte did CSS3,
Okay.
and Rachel Andrew did the new CSS layout or something like that, like 2 or 3 years ago, when this stuff
Okay.
was all new.
So as always, I have loads of questions. I just obviously, I think I want to open the floor first, see if there's any questions from anyone else. So either you guys can just unmute yourself, or you can ask in the chat if you want to. I see there's actually a question here, but high up by Johannes about is it possible to do relative positioning for grid items? For example, grid row start -1, which would position the grid item 1 row up from its natural row.
Yes. Yes, you can.
Okay.
Okay.
So you're not constrained by placement, yeah. Yeah.
Could you maybe give an example of that, how that would look like in practice?
If I'm understanding correctly, let's say naturally an item it starts on grid column 2 and ends on grid column 3, and it starts on grid row 2 and it ends on grid row 3, right?
Yeah.
For example, you can position that anywhere you like in that grid.
Right.
So
you can also, yeah, so you can also then, so you don't need to give an absolute kind of row or column number. You can also relatively move it.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can also, in Flexbox, we have order, the order property, that applies in grid as well. So if you've got something that's number 7 and you actually want it to be number 2, you can just say order 2 and it's done.
Yeah. Okay.
Not great for accessibility.
Yeah, no, for sure. I guess the complication is also if you have a variable number of and kind of unknown at the time of styling, a variable number of items where you don't know, what the total size of the grid is. So I think that's where the complication came in for me.
Yeah, so that's a really good point and question, because grid will often just create rows and columns that you haven't specified. If there suddenly are like 20 extra items, it's just going to automatically make them follow the grid structure without you actually saying, oh, I need 10 rows or whatever. So then where that is now positioned is sometimes unclear. So to manually move something around, it's not something you'd really want to do in an element that where you're unsure how many children are going to be inside that parent. You could end up with something that you didn't intend. But if you know, okay, this is always going to be this size with these items, go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for the answer.
I see there's another one by Johannes as well. No, by all means, like if it's not you, it's going to be me. How does min content and max content differ from with auto?
So just to maybe clarify there also, I guess what confused me, I'm not familiar with min content and max content. I wasn't familiar with it before you explained it, Justin. But so with auto, I guess if you are in inline mode, width auto will make the width adapt to the size of the content, right? But I mean, in a block mode, I guess it would then adapt to 100% of the width. So is min content and max content then more kind of relevant to block level styling?
No, not necessarily. You can do it on inline elements as well. So let's say you have a grid and your column is 300 pixels wide, right?
Yeah.
Let's not, no, that's a bad example. Let's say you're using a fractional unit, right? So when you're using a fractional unit, you just say take up as much space as you need to, right? Or in Flex, you're saying, Flex auto. 10
Right.
whatever. Flex base is auto. Be as big as you need to be. Okay. So if you say width auto on something that's inside that item, it's going to try and be as wide as its parent.
Okay. Right. Yeah.
Min and max, the parent is out of the equation. It doesn't matter how wide the parent is.
Okay, I see.
So it's the element itself.
Yeah.
Element itself.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah. Thanks, that makes sense.
There's a really, I don't know if anyone knows Ahmed Shahid.
Is that the Flexbox without Flexbox?
No, I'm not sure. He writes really good stuff on all these things, and he's got a really good article on min and max and so on. I'll try and find it, and I'll post it on the meetup link or something when meetup's back.
Okay, no, I was thinking of a guy called Keenan Yusuf. He has a great article or a great resource in terms of how.
Using you there.
You still there?
Yeah, we just lost you for a second.
Or was it me or was it us that were losing you? So no, I was thinking of a guy. Oh man, no, I don't know if it's me or it's Justin. Damn it, I guess my wife's like streaming in HD again. So no, I was thinking of a resource by a guy called Keenan Yusuf, who he has a great resource in terms of how you would accomplish Flexbox, like anything in Flexbox without using Flexbox. I'm gonna link it.
Right, does he do like display table?
Yeah. And I used to do a lot of these back when Flexbox was still like kind of you did all the prefixing and all of that. So there's a question by Freddie who asks, would it be worthwhile to focus on development primarily with logical properties instead of more traditional properties?
Yes. I really think it's time, but there are some browser support issues. So I'm not even going to mention IE because obviously it's not going to be in IE. So if that's an issue, then you've got to use supports or something like that. Or you can't use the cascade, right? Because it's not the same property. So you've got to use supports. The other issue is that Safari does not support the shorthand. However, it is in the WebKit technology preview, but who knows when Apple just done a major OS update. There's new Safari, but this is not in the latest Safari. So who knows when that's going to arrive. Apple are not very generous with their browser releases. So you'd still need to write the longhand version, which is a little bit painful and onerous, but you can make that work with the cascade. So if you don't need to support IE, I would say yes. I mean, my personal website, I've used these everywhere. Okay, I mean that's not entirely true. There are some things there that's still using the old ways. But as I add new things to that site, I'm definitely moving way more towards logical properties. They just make sense to me far more than that old box model. Of margin outside, padding inside, border somewhere in between, but change it to box sizing and border box and all of that. And yeah, I mean, I guess I just like writing them. It makes sense to me. Padding, block, start. Yeah, that's great. And then in size, block size. It's very intuitive because we're so used to working with flow layout. It just makes sense to me. So I would say yes. dependent on those obvious caveats that IE is going to break, and Safari, you need to do a bit of extra work. That's become the standard now, hasn't it, with Safari, that you need to do a bit of extra work.
Yeah, pretty much. I suppose we can probably write some mixins for it to make up for it.
The SAS would be pretty easy, yeah. You could do some nice SAS stuff with it, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think specifically in this case, like it really brings to the forefront, like that I'm like kind of my disappointment that post CSS didn't really take off to the extent that I was hoping, because I think there's also a lot of work that post CSS can do here.
Yeah, definitely.
But it never really, post CSS unfortunately never picked up for whatever reason, I don't know. But, you know, like we could have essentially had kind of transpilation for CSS. And this is a very good example where that would have worked nicely, but, you know. But so, you know, I'm going to ask a question about container queries. Yeah. So no, but I think it's also very topical at this point, because, you know, like it seemed to be dead, and then out of the blue, it seems like it's on track now again. Yeah. And yeah, and also, you know, like it's worth noting that responsive images also kind of, I think, died like 5 times and was resurrected like 5 times again. So yeah, I guess that's just the way these.
Curious to know what kind of an uptake responsive images has actually had. Like,
yeah, so
90% of the web using responsive images. I think it's probably more like 9.
I think
anyway, that's inside. That's sorry.
No.
Container queries.
No. Like I think it's actually valid, and I think it's also relevant, because I think you know, like we're facing the same thing with container queries, that like, and I think it's the same with responsive images. Like the prime time where it was actually most needed has kind of passed already to a certain degree. I think it was most needed when kind of I think atomic design really started picking up, and specifically like in the early days of like Pattern Lab and those type of things. And I think to a certain degree we've kind of developed, and I think this is the same for responsive images, that we've developed so many workflows to deal with that problem, that by the time it actually arrives, like, you know, like we need to change the whole way we approach the web when we've kind of solved it. Sorry?
Yeah, I know. I think you're right there.
And I think it's the same with responsive images. I think there's just so much material, so many tutorials, so many patterns out there in terms of how to solve this problem without responsive images, that by the time responsive images finally came around, I almost want to say the urgency of the problem wasn't as pressing anymore.
No, I agree with that. Yeah,
and
I think
I
container queries are going to suffer the same fate if they arrive, because they're not going to arrive soon. It's going to be years before they arrive. That's a very, very difficult problem to solve in the browser. And I think with a lot of the grid and Flexbox capabilities we have, I mean, I use so few media queries these days. I find I'm hardly, grabbing for them nowadays, because I don't need
exactly.
And with grid and Flexbox and our sizing properties and our the box alignment module, I think we already have a lot of tools that in many ways obviate the need for container queries.
No, exactly. Obviously having it now would still be great. There are cases where I would use it, but I'm no longer at the point where I was maybe 3-4 4 years ago where I would have sold my kidney to be able to do, like, for someone to just create container queries.
Yeah.
But
And I think we also have, with the growth of JavaScript frameworks as well, that and things like, you know, CSS and JS and CSS modules and stuff like that, we have things are a lot more tightly coupled to components than they were in the past. We don't have these monolithic style sheets so much anymore.
No, for sure. Yeah.
And I think that makes a huge difference too.
Yeah.
I mean, if we ever had web components, we wouldn't have had this issue at all, right?
Oh, geez. Yeah, like, oh, you actually attended my, like the discussion last time with Jason Miller. So I don't want to open up that web components can of worms again, but like to a certain degree, you know, I think like my disillusionment with kind of container queries and I guess a lot of these things actually stem from that. I think like there was a nice intersection between Grid, like when Grid like came out and kind of like the wave of web components hype. And it very much seemed like, you know, we're finally solving like all these problems on the web, you know, and we're moving fast. I think one of the big takeaways for anyone kind of that witnessed like just the explosion that was Grid support all of a sudden, that was very strange. Like just a strange period to live through, like in terms of, you know, you heard about the CSS mechanism, and then within 6 months you can actually start using it in production. So yeah, but I think like since then I guess I've gotten a bit more jaded, because it seems like we solve problems and then just 3 more problems pop up that, you know, remain unsolved.
Yeah, the nature of the medium in many ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you did mention kind of what did Jen Simmons call it again? Intrinsic web, or what was this?
Intrinsic design.
Intrinsic design, yeah. So yeah, I've read a lot of her material on this, and like she is convinced it's kind of like the equivalent of like the advent of responsive web design for our day and age. Yeah, and I don't know whether it's maybe just me being being jaded, or but I don't know. Like I'm not really sharing her kind of excitement about that. I don't know, like you obviously do, because you wrote an entire talk on it.
Yeah, I definitely.
Is it?
I do agree with her. I think she's right when she says this is a new, this is a break with what we've done in the past. Very much so. Because Grid and Flexbox really has the potential for us to never use a media query again. And that means responsive design, as we know it, is not a thing anymore. And I think that's a massive thing. And we've always talked about grids in design for the web, but we've never really used a grid, right? We've made our content fit a predetermined notion of what a grid might be. And that's always been, you know, determined arbitrarily in many ways. Whereas now we're explicitly creating a grid. And even in Flexbox, we're doing that. It's just on one axis rather than 2, but it's still creating a very, very specific layout context that we didn't have before. And I think that's a massive shift. And also with logical properties and sizing and being the way it is now with intrinsic sizing, I think those are completely different modes of thinking about layout. And this whole this whole notion of, sorry, Scott, I'm going on a bit. This whole notion of how we design for the web has changed. I see the days of 500 screens in Sketch or Figma or whatever are over. Yeah, obviously they won't be because, you know, but
Yeah.
that's not the way to do it. You know, I think it's Mark Dalgleish who's always going on about this, that the browser is a design tool. Way much more. I mean, I love Sketch. I can spend days working in it. It's fantastic. But not giving you the experience of the medium where your design lives.
No, 100% agree. But I think that's an entire topic in itself.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read or you know about kind of how to speak machine.
Yes, John Maeda.
Yeah, which is why I didn't want to pronounce his name because I wanted you to pronounce it.
You let me
Because I have no idea how to pronounce his surname. But yeah, so I've been reading that slowly and steadily, and I think that kind of digs into a lot of this. Like, and I think like he is not far off by saying we're kind of in a crisis in terms of the way we design technology and software. And I mean design as in like including visual design, and how we think about the design process. And like I see this quite a lot as well, like because I also teach a lot do a lot of teaching at the intersection between design and development and so forth. And like I have to say, it's a lot easier actually teaching Flexbox based design, even if you don't know how Flexbox works, than kind of like the 12 column grid thing. I think those of us that kind of grew up with kind of like the 12 column grid, like we take for granted, like conceptually how hard it is to wrap your head around like what actually goes on there. And just saying like, listen, like things move around and you can have it just like wrap and whatever with Flexbox. But yeah, I'm curious what the implications are going to be when grid starts becoming more widely adopted. Because I think to a certain degree, grid requires a bit of a technical understanding, whereas with Flexbox, it's essentially just, you can think of it as like an Excel sheet, like columns, you can stretch the columns, you can condense them, whatever. Whereas I think grid requires a bit more of an understanding of the actual medium itself.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just the technicalities behind grid are a lot more complex. By its nature of being two-dimensional, right? I mean, I hardly touched on, I feel like I spoke for a long time, but I still hardly scratched the surface of grid. It's massive. It's really massive. And it's not that easy to understand, really, how this is working, especially when you start to get into like naming areas and all that kind of stuff. It's difficult. Yeah. So, and to think about how you design for that layout possibility becomes something different. Yeah. I'm also wary, as I always am with any new technology that we get in CSS, that we go through a phase of horrendous design.
No, I 100% agree. But to be honest, with layouts, there's only so much worse it can get.
No, I mean, in grid you can just stack stuff on top of each other. The couple of lines.
But I think
yeah,
I definitely share your concern with things like variable fonts and so forth. But to me, like layout has just been such a dumpster fire on the web for so long that I'm like, it can't get much worse. Like, sure, you can do that, but you can also like import the entire Bootstrap library just to do a column. So, I think we're working from a very low baseline at the moment, where it's gonna have to get substantially worse for it to have been a bad decision.
Yeah. No, Yeah, you're right. I'm being a little facetious.
Yeah.
You know, people get their hands on shiny tools and they tend to go a bit mad with them.
Mm. So obviously you've spent a lot more time kind of like digging into this, kind of like reading up on layout and so forth. I'm curious, what's your take on what do you see as kind of what does a post-grid world look like?
You mean when grid is just a thing that we do?
No, well, that, but also like, you know, what would be the next big thing
What's next?
in terms of layout? Yeah.
Subgrid.
Yeah, I'm thinking a bit further in the future. Yeah.
Sure. I don't really know how to answer that question because I'm not sure. I don't really know what's next. I think this has been such a massive change that it's going to be with us for a while, and it's taken like 9 years to get it going. So I don't see much changing.
Yeah.
I don't think there's another layout thing, to be honest. I think Flexbox, grid, and column, multi-column, that's where we are. I don't see us really moving beyond that. I mean, assuming, of course, that the future of the web remains HTML and CSS, and not, you know, JSON objects like that guy.
No, sure. Yeah. No, well, I hear what you say, like, because you know, like, even things like WASM and so forth, you still need to use the DOM, and so forth. That can only get you so far. So yeah.
No, exactly. I mean, we are at the mercy of the browser always.
Yeah. So, like, no, I think what I was specifically thinking more in terms of, and like, I was kind of curious whether this is what you would actually say is, you know, like, I was thinking more in terms of like, there's probably a very real possibility that at some point we're going to move past this conception of a page. And you know, like, kind of this conceptual model of you know, like, kind of, I'm loading a page, I'm loading a new page, you know, I click here, and what the layout implications for that would be, because also once again our layout or conceptual models around laying things out is also very much grounded in that concept of a page.
It is very much. But I don't actually see that changing. And I think I don't see that changing because of links at that simplest level of, you know, the hyperlink being the fundamental building block of the entire web. And there's always going to be that movement. I think what you might see and how that's represented might be, you know, completely different to what we know now. But I still think that in that conceptual model of how the whole thing is underpinned is not going to change. And so you're always moving to a different space, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think we will stop using the term page, but I still think that model is going to be the same.
Yeah, like, I guess maybe the type of things that I'm thinking of as more like edge case at the moment. I think my assumption is these will get more common as we kind of continue down this path of building software in the browser. You know, like, so I'm thinking more in terms of like Trello, Figma, those type of things, you know. So, for example, something like Figma doesn't really have a conception of it. Well, it does have a conception of a page, but not of a web page. Oh, geez, of a web page, but like in your canvas.
You still keep something to get there.
You're the one designing the web page.
No, in the web page.
Yeah, in the web page. Yeah, so I was curious because I think I worked recently So I think where my thought process around this is going, I don't know if you've kind of encountered like any things around like virtualized lists and those type of things.
Sorry, I missed that.
So I don't know if you've ever worked with like virtualized lists and those things.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so that's quite a common pattern, especially in things where you have kind of infinite scrolling, like for example the Facebook news feed, where it's essentially just like it's essentially just a massive position relative thing, and then as you scroll, it only renders the part that you're looking at. Because you can very easily get to a point where you have thousands and thousands of DOM nodes if you just keep on scrolling. So so it kind of does some trickery of position absolute and whatever. Yeah, and I think that's maybe kind of the type of things that I was thinking about, because there you're kind of stretching kind of the limits of this concept of a page. Because you have effectively an infinite page that just goes on and you never reach an end. Yeah. So I was, yeah.
A scroll into action rather than a click into action.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But that's one case. Like obviously you get the same type of thing like in stuff like Figma and so forth. So yeah, I think that's maybe more where I was going in terms of kind of like a post-page world. So obviously the bulk of the web is, I guess, always going to be documents, just because of how big something like Wikipedia is. Like and how
and the majority of the web isn't apps. It's little websites built in WordPress and stuff like that. That are really documentation.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just like curious, like as a thought experiment for myself.
It's definitely a question, but I don't feel like I have a much of an answer to it.
No, for sure.
Definitely something to think about.
Yeah. So I see there was another question by Nathan, and that is for you specifically, Justin. What problems in terms of layout on the web do you think still need to be addressed? And how do you see that most likely happening?
Okay. This is a big question, a good one.
Time for talk two. Buckle in.
Okay. So I think in terms of the CSS specs, that is, the layout spec and the alignment spec. And remember, CSS now is not like a monolithic thing anymore. We're not going to have like CSS 4 or something. We're just going to have different versions of different specs. So these three, those ones are, sorry, those two are the ones that are being worked on the most. I don't think there's anything wrong with the specs. Yeah. So my answer to the question, I guess, is the issues lie with the browser makers and not with the specs themselves. I think the specs are fine. I don't think there's anything in there that we still need. But we need browsers to get with the program, man, so to speak. And in particular, Chrome has had a subgrid bug that's been open for 18 months because it just doesn't exist. Firefox has been forging ahead in layout. I mean, for years, actually. They've done everything before everyone else. But I see like lots of bottlenecks in browser priorities. Like, I'm finding it a little bit difficult to articulate this. So like I see different priorities with different browser makers, right? So Chrome, for me, their priority is not necessarily the experience of the end user. Their priority is ad revenue. Safari, their priority is not the experience of the end user. Their priority is you know, here's a browser where maybe you'll find out about an app you can buy in our store, kind of thing. And Edge is just Chromium, yeah, so the same. And I think, so I'm not sure I'm even answering this question. I might just be ranting about browsers, but
it's them damn browsers, man.
no, I don't think this working group needs to address anything. I think they've addressed all the things that we need, and comprehensively as well, and over many years. But I think the browser makers are not, they're not moving fast enough. That's the problem we need to solve. You know, we get all these JavaScript APIs that no one's ever going to use, right? Like, are you going to use, I don't know, I can't think of one now, but I mean, you know, there are all these damn JavaScript browser APIs, like Motion, right? Compass or whatever. Who's going to use that, like on your laptop? Yeah, no one's ever going to use that. But oh yeah, well, Chrome, we support that now. Like, I don't care. Give me subgrid, man. That's what makes the experience of the web like better for everybody who uses it. So yeah. So and it's not like these browser vendors aren't represented on these working groups. They're all a part of them. And I just think priorities are skewed. Yeah, priorities are skewed. We've gone into a very JavaScript-centric world. And I'm not against JavaScript at all. I think it's fantastic and it's amazing. But we've lost a little bit of a balance. And with these layout things that we have, like all the ones I've been talking about, we make users' experience way better, way better. And so I think there needs to be a balance between, look at this cool JavaScript API that lets me, you know, find your download speed versus, so I can test that, you know, and then send you even more JavaScript. Versus, well, how do we make things good for people to use and also in a way that is easy for us as front-end developers to use, where we don't need to struggle with horrendous CSS to make a column, you know, where we can do it really easily and we can make it an experience that's seamless across devices and screens and what have you, and make it a really good experience for the users. I'm sorry, that turned into a rant.
So official answer, it's all these damn JavaScript APIs, man. No, but I do hear what you say, and you know, this is unfortunately one of those things. You know, I've made peace with it like a long time ago. Like browsers are always browsers are always going to prioritize user experience over developer experience. You know, if they can ship something new that's going to be nice for the user, they're going to do that instead of something more humble that's going to kind of make developers' life a bit easier. They're not going to do that. I think like there's also, you know, one thing that I often think about is, you know, like it's also like to a certain degree, I think kind of almost like game theory, where you don't want to invest time into something if you don't know whether the other browsers are actually going to do it, because that might just be wasted time and development resources. And I think kind of the HTML outline is one of those things. And yeah, and I think another one is kind of blend modes, you know, where you have all these browsers, that these vendors that spent a lot of time actually building that out, and Safari is kind of holding everyone back from even using it. So effectively, they've wasted development resources into something that's not production ready. That they could. So I think like it's also, there is this kind of weird game theory dynamic where it's easier to go with functionality that has a lot of hype because you know the other browser vendors are going to follow suit, and like the time that you put in is actually going to lead to actual like real outcomes, as opposed to putting time into a spec that you can't say with certainty the other vendors are actually going to do themselves as well. Yeah, it's a weird world, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I see Nathan's asking whether, you know, a technical committee
Well,
will
sure.
not help address this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the CSS working group is one of those technical committees, and all the browser vendors are on it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what the people interested in CSS are going to and would like to work on, that their voice is not going to be drowned out by other people who on the you know, the JavaScript development team. So it's a difficult one. It's a really difficult one.
Yeah, I think also, you know, like as is always the problem with tech and tech teams is, you know, the people on these committees are very technical in nature, but the people making the decisions aren't necessarily as directly involved. They tend to have a more managerial background. So
and business. Yeah, and I think that's why Firefox has been so progressive in this realm. It's because they're not a profit organization. They don't need to gather ad revenue, and so I think that's driven their adoption of CSS in this way. And of course, you know, Jen Simmons running the thing. But so I think that, as you say, different priorities.
Isn't Jen Simmons now with Safari, the Safari team?
Yeah, she's with the Safari team now.
Yeah, so like yes, to hoping, like, that's very interesting, but like, yeah, I'm hoping she kind of like, sorry, I just kind of remember that, and I thought, like, can that actually be? Yeah.
For a few months already, like maybe even a year or so. But Apple, they move so slow. Yeah.
Cool. So, but I think we've kind of covered a lot there. It's essentially just the two of us and Nathan still here.
Well, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, but yeah, like it's a pity that Meetup went down and all of that. I think
I'm happy to do it again.
And I think then you can finish
before
up
the end of the year if you want to.
Sure, I think that's maybe pushing it a bit. But I think, like, let's aim for early next year, and then you can also finish up your site.
Yeah, cool. That'll just make my talk longer, though.
Well, we can even, I don't know, maybe we can even do a series.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, so, you know, like, have a specific one about Grid, one about Flexbox, and so forth.
Yeah, I have an agenda, so I'm happy to push it.
Cool. All right. Cool. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Nathan. I'll probably see if I can upload this thing tomorrow morning.
Okay, great.
Cool. But then we'll chat again. Yeah. Sorry.
No rush.
Yeah. No, but I've learned that, you know, if I leave it, you know, it's it's one of those things. If you don't do it immediately, it's not going to get done. It's like an email. You either reply immediately or you reply in 2 years. You know, there's no in between.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, man. But then we'll chat again soon.
Cool. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Nathan.
Cheers, Nathan.